Hey guys, so there's a new New York Times opinion piece saying that Koreans, the Korean government, Korean society in general has this unhealthy obsession with Japan when it comes to getting an apology, healing the trauma of the occupation, the colonialization, the wartime sexual slavery, the wartime forced laborers. Why can't we just get over it and move on? Now, here's the thing. There is a difference between this so-called unhealthy obsession and just, I'm keeping my eye on you. I am watching because you're still acting super sus. It's sort of like this. Let's say if some floozy or some hoe or anybody, your friend especially, or somebody who is supposed to be an acquaintance or an ally, went off and slept with your spouse, right? And they never ever apologize for it. They refuse to apologize. And not only that, they go around saying like, oh, it may be a misunderstanding. And they tell the children that's not what happened. They're like basically rewriting history. And not only will they not acknowledge it and then downplay the incident, but they're still flirting with your spouse. Now, if you are forced in this situation to continue the relationship the way that South Korea and Japan and the United States are allied, so there's no getting out of that marriage, then yes, Korea, if you have seen all of the strides that Korea has made, they have done their best to compromise and to not get revenge, not to cause a huge fuss, but continuously ask for the apology and which they'll never get. But that doesn't mean that even if you forgive, that you're not going to pay close attention to the actions of somebody who had betrayed you so utterly and will not acknowledge it. Now, the big difference that we've seen is with Germany's post-World War II actions. They don't rewrite the history books, the textbooks that go to the children, to the next generation, that downplay or even spin any kind of wartime atrocity. They fully embrace it, and they are on this teaching path, basically like, close your legs to married men. And to not have that sort of thing happen again. Now, this week, we saw yet again Japan claim key maritime territorial zones of Korea. Where? In the 2023 Diplomatic Blue Book. So this is not some kind of radical far-right group, although there are a lot of those in Japan. It's not a sentiment that Korean people are upset with. It is official diplomatic policy and a diplomatic statement and diplomatic belief by Japan, again, trying to take your man, trying to take the Dokdo Islets, which, you've heard probably many times before if you are a Korea fan. But it's not just a bunch of rocks. Essentially, it is a border that creates a security zone in the ocean. So let's say it's a fence around the country. So you have the landmass, but you also have the ocean territory. And what that would do, it's basically, I'm going like this because it creates a big buffer along the east coast of South Korea. And also with it, it also comes economic rights like fishing rights. You get to control, the shipping as well. And it is a sovereign territory. It's essentially like somebody trying to steal your property. And this came up again. As always, it is very much well expected because Japan continuously does that. That is why Korea continuously has their eyes on Japan. It is not some unhealthy obsession. Yes, there are people in Korea who are really hurting. They're still traumatized. They want to have some redress by Japan. And like I said before, in some ways, I do believe we need to take a new approach, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to turn a blind eye and leave, your spouse with that person unattended and leave yourself vulnerable. Now, that's where I think President Yoon has kind of been placed in that position where he has now put Korea in a vulnerable position. He really compromised on the latest episode with the Supreme Court ruling over Japan's forced, basically they enslaved Korean people during World War II. They didn't apologize for that. And then so Korea said that, okay, we will pay the reparations to the victims and their families. They'll set up a government-sponsored fund that is funded by Korean corporations, and essentially Korean corporations that did have some sort of benefit. Like I said before in a previous video, POSCO was one of the lead corporations, and a lot of the corporations, when they got started here in Korea, they seized assets that were previously Japan's, or they had benefited from the $500 million fund that Park Chung-hee had signed in 1965 to get relations back on track. And so, again, we've said before, Japan thinks that, okay, well, we cut you a check back in 1965, $500 million, that absolves us of any guilt, case closed, stop talking about it. But that money didn't go to the victims. It basically just went to corporations and people who may not have been a victim at all, but boom, they get a factory, they get government contracts, boom, So it's not, it didn't really solve. It didn't solve the trauma and the pain. And I don't think we'll ever get an apology. So in some ways, I do agree that we have to take a different approach where we're not necessarily just like being like, please apologize, please apologize, please apologize, because that puts you in a weaker position. President Yoon is about to go to the United States for a state visit later this month. And it looks like the Biden administration really wants to put everybody on the same page in the alliance, make sure that we're all hunky-dory so that we can counter the rising threat of China. And a piece like this in the New York Times, I think, was essentially requested in order to push that narrative forward. However, I think there has been a huge backlash. And I know the guy who wrote it. I've met him a few times. I don't know him extremely well. But I wonder where the line was between his words and also the editorial staff. He said that a lot of his editorial had to be cut due to word limitations. But what was left was, I think, extremely problematic. He basically said that Koreans have been unable to move on from Japan's colonization of the Korean peninsula, and that it's like a form of national brainwashing. I don't think you'd ever say that to the African Americans who are descendants of slaves in the United States, to basically kind of forget about all of that. It's kind of a brainwashing thing. And you certainly wouldn't say that to Jewish people in terms of their history with the Holocaust. We all have this in our history, so we shouldn't be so quick to run to like flippant editorials like this, where it says like, it's time for South Koreans to let go of these unhealthy emotions. We share too much in common with Japan. Now, this mischaracterizes Koreans because there are many Korean people who appreciate Japan, travel to Japan. I mean, he in his editorial said that, like, oh, when I went to Japan, there were so many Korean people. I heard more Korean being spoken than Japanese where I was at. That has been going on for decades. And, even before the latest controversy, for decades, people in Korea and Japan have shared cultural affinities and travel and, relations and even like intermarriage. So that is kind of characterizing this in a weird way, saying like suddenly there is this group of people who just want to all let it go and just embrace Japan. Korean people have been embracing Japan, like I said, for decades, while being cautious, while not forgetting that they're owed something. And even if you don't get what's owed, you don't want to get stolen from again. And that is the thing that Korean people are still, if you are in the less emotional camp, you're still kind of keeping your eye out, because something like this may happen again, especially if in your diplomatic blue books you still want some of our territory, where you still are revising your textbooks to rewrite history. That doesn't show a good faith actor. Now, this is where I think President Yoon needs to spin it around, where now on the positive angle, because he's gotten a lot of crap for his recent capitulation to Japan to set up Korea's own fund to compensate for Japan's colonialism. But what he did do was indicate that was really far, and it was precedent breaking. No other Korean president has ever made that move in terms of giving so much in terms of a compromise to Japan. So now he has to really make sure that people know that the ball is in Japan's court. It's up to Japan now to then show good faith, because right now it's basically the situation is just like really just keep continuously gaslighting the victim, saying like, why can't you forgive, why can't you forgive, why can't you forgive, while when you look at a lot of Korea's actions over history, it has been one of forgiveness or trying to forget or trying to work with Japan. Yes, there'll always be your crew protesting and standing up for you and demanding that apology, but that is not the entire Korean population. I'd say the majority of the Korean population are much more sober. They are in the middle. They want to be careful. They want to have their eyes open. And when this editorial ended with, I took my mother to Japan last month to see the cherry blossoms in bloom. Post-pandemic travel between the two countries has surged and Korean tourists were everywhere. And as we strolled along the Sumida River in Tokyo, she let out a contented sigh, turned to me and said, "This country is so beautiful and civilized." Now, there are a lot of Korean people that say Japan is beautiful and civilized. And I think the way that this was edited was to make it really dramatic and say like, oh my gosh, this country is one of peace and beauty, so we should trust it and get over it. And under the connotation that some people can pick up is just like, but then what about Korea? What are you saying about Korea? And then this really kicks it up into kind of like a Japanese sympathizer type of statement where Koreans like Japan more than Korea and are willing to sell out their own country. Not saying that that's exactly what happened here, but that is in a way where the spirit of this editorial has been edited to move. And that is a very dangerous psychological game to play. So whoever was thinking they can pull a fast one, like either it was maybe a Japan-funded or far-right Japan-funded think tank who has, you know, the intellectual minds kind of influencing it in this direction, or whether it's US policy that just thinks that they can, you know, move it along. Because I would say that it is a little bit still biased towards Japan. Japan has a lot more of the infrastructure set up to influence the influence makers over in Washington, D.C. Some of the congressional delegations that come over, they're kind of, you know, organized by think tanks that are more have Japan origins. So you have to really be very careful with the way that you want to think that it's about trilateral cooperation. Everybody's in it for a altruistic purpose of peace, but we know that that's not the real world, and that everybody has an agenda. And, you know, if you're putting the money behind it, you're going to put your agenda in it. And this is why we have close eyes on stuff like this, and that it's not an unhealthy obsession. It's like we're trying to pick up on the cues, just like, did you just give my spouse a look? Did you just, you know, like a lot of these things are subtle, but they are power plays. Because let's talk quickly about the whole spying scandal by the CIA that was released in those Pentagon documents that really had like some good formats. They must have picked up like, you know, some people who were laid off from magazines, because if you looked at some of these screenshots, I was able to find a few because they stripped them down from the internet. They look really good. They got colored graphs and great fonts and nice spacing and columns. So kudos. I wish everybody could read this. I wish that could be like our new Newsweek. But apparently it was leaked by some people who are like young kids. Somehow they don't know exactly who originally lifted them out of a briefcase or somewhere, and they took pictures of it. And then some kids on these Discord servers, essentially chat groups that are designed for primarily gamers, they started like uploading it, I think, just to build clout. I don't think that they were trying to necessarily do anything nefarious. I think they were just bragging. They're like, ooh, I got these Pentagon papers. And from that, we did see accusations, or we did see reports purportedly saying that the CIA had been spying on top political leaders here in Korea and intercepted it through like technology, like either it's cell phones or wiretapping or whatnot. Now, we heard like some very walked back statements to keep the peace, I think. Again, you know, we don't know what's going on behind closed doors, but mommy and daddy going out, you know, saying that, oh, no, this is a fabrication. A lot of these documents that were leaked had some falsifications, but they didn't say what. And South Korea officially is saying like, no, this is not true. They're not spying on us. We have robust security over in the presidential compound. Although at the same time, that is really disingenuous, because it's a very well-known fact that every country spies on each other. And if they didn't, where does all that budget go? Okay, what are they doing, you know, with all of that money? Of course, that budget is going to spy. On the other hand, it is rude, it is threatening to sovereignty, but this makes me feel a little bit upset, because again, it shows Korea a little bit in a weak position. Yes, publicly you have to say like, oh, this is not a threat, it didn't really happen, calm down everybody. But instead of that, I would like South Korea to intimate basically like, yeah, they might have spied, but they didn't get that much. And by the way, we got stuff too. And is it the case where South Korea can't spy? I doubt that. Watch your Samsung phone. I'm not saying there's a back door, but I don't know. And why is it that President Yoon seems to be capitulating, making it look like South Korea is kind of will go whichever way you tell them? This is something I think he needs to keep in mind when he goes over to the United States, not to get out negotiated, because already we've seen in other international forums where he felt snubbed by the US delegation, even called them like a curse word, like, come on, President Yoon, grow a pair. And of course, the Korean public did vote for somebody who was not going to be like such a shark or like a wolf in sheep's clothing. But in order for him to be able to have some sort of gravitas on the world stage, he needs to grow a pair. So even though President Yoon called the eavesdropping suspicions absurd and false, if we are to believe what did come out, I actually think that it was a good thing that was conveyed to us, because it showed a government that was South Korean government that was acting very calm and careful and trying to weigh its options and actually doing international diplomacy that was focused on for the best well-being of South Korea and its alliance in terms of military. But when you read between the lines, what they're really trying to protect is Korean industries and businesses. And so Korean economy has been doing that well. And if we read between the lines again with the deal with Japan that got President Yoon into a lot of flack with the forced labor issue, that was to release, yes, it was to be about, trilateral relations, but it was essentially Japan had this leverage over Korea that it was using. Again, we're looking at you being like, you're not being a team player. You're trying to leverage these key ingredients, chemicals that we have to import from Japan to make our semiconductors, which is like number one or number two top industry in Korea. So Japan is threatening Korea's economy. That's why people are, you're acting sus again. And he capitulated on this, then the chemicals came and we can make our semiconductors. The whole thing with the leak of the CIA document shows that Korea was a bit hesitant in supplying weapons that would eventually go to Ukraine because it did not want the end user to be Ukraine, because that's going to threaten essentially Russian gas imports to Korea. And gas, oil is like the also top 5, even top 3 industry in Korea. It's always say it's ironic, we have no oil of our own, but in terms of export volume, it's like number 1 or number 2, because we get the oil, we refine it, and then we make sure we have enough for ourselves in Korea to maintain energy security, and then export out the remainder at a profit. And so LNG is a key source. Russia's not the biggest source. The biggest source is Australia. I had no idea. So Australia and Qatar. So it's usually like Qatar, Australia. It fluctuates between number 1 and number 2 depending on the year. And guess what? Jungkook, when he went to Qatar and did the performance, do you think that's a coincidence? And do you think it's a coincidence that bilateral trade went up 42% between South Korea and Qatar? Look, BTS, that was the worst decision by the Korean government to disband BTS, because BTS literally is almost signing these oil contracts, okay? Jungkook almost was basically signing that oil contract with his performance. I've never seen a violin or a cello or a piano played by a Korean person playing some, dead European man's music, although I love my classical music. Never seen that sign an oil contract. So now I think President Yoon needs to flip the script. He needs to show that we have done so much in good faith to forgive the past and to try to make amends with it, but make it clear it's without Japan's participation. It's truly one of these instances where you are forgiving in order for you to move on, but not necessarily to just say you get a free pass to the person who's still not apologized. And then at the same time, on top of that, start to point out where Japan is not being an even player. Start to point out where Japan is trying to leverage its position in order to threaten Korea's future and Korea's economy. Korean people's well-being, in terms of like, if you crush the economy, you crush the livelihood, you crush the security, and continue to say that, look, instead of saying like, why are you not apologizing? Why do you still want to take our territory? Basically say like, look, you're not acting in good faith. We have done everything to show that we are here to play nice and be a good allied partner, but you continuously are trying to undermine our trust. And that's the big thing. I think President Yoon needs to recycle this notion that he might have like, oh, we have to kind of listen. And basically, look, we need to see trust. Otherwise, and then find places of different leverage where he doesn't need to have Japan for these chemicals. He doesn't need to have Russia for the LNG imports, and create more deals where basically we're a lot less reliant on these imports that can be used as leverage to get these types of diplomatic concessions, and then at the same time maybe withhold some of Korea's finished goods. If they had kept BTS, they'd be like, well, you want a concert over there? I don't know. We might not give it to you. You're not showing us some trust. Or there can be plenty of other ways, as long as you continuously develop the soft power exports of Korea to use as leverage, not destroy them. So in a way, the responsibility does fall upon President Yoon. You have to take responsibility for yourself, but at the same time, don't call Korean people unhealthily obsessed with Japan and its past with Korea, because people are looking at whether we can trust you in the present and in the future. And that is essentially what alliances are based on. Trust now and trust in the future. And the way that Japan has been acting continuously on a diplomatic level shows, at the very least, Koreans deserve and are allowed, and we don't need anybody telling us not to, keep an eye out for any sus behavior. All right, guys, well, what do you think? Put your comments below. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe. See you again next time. Bye-bye.